Well, shalom, dear friends, and welcome to our ongoing Bible study of the Acts of the Apostles. And today we're going to be in Acts chapter 23. So let's go ahead and look at our preliminary PowerPoint here just briefly before we get to the text itself. We are on the chronology timeline. Right here, about 58 Common Era, or 58 Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. Paul has completed his third missionary journey and has returned to Jerusalem, as was his desire, despite the fact that all along his road back towards Jerusalem, his friends and loved ones were encouraging him not to go to Jerusalem. And there were even prophetic warnings that kind of disaster was awaiting him there. But I'm convinced that he was convinced that it was God's will that he go to Jerusalem. And so he did. He was intending to go there for the Feast of Pentecost, which is a one-day annual feast, whereas the spring festivals and the fall festivals involve week-long stays in Jerusalem. Pentecost was just one day, but he wanted to be there for Pentecost, and I think probably that he was there on the day of Pentecost, went into the temple courts to worship, and there he was confronted, he was arrested, he was brutalized there in the temple courts. I assume that took place on the day of Pentecost. So he was dragged outside the temple courts, and he was brutally beaten. A group, a squad, maybe a platoon or something like that of Roman soldiers from the Antonia fortress, which was just north of the temple complex, rescued him from the hands of the hostile Jewish assailants, took him into protective custody. And as they were as the Romans were leading Paul away into the protective cover of the Antonia fortress, Paul said he desired to speak with the crowd, and so they permitted that to happen. And Paul spoke with them in Hebrew, and he gave the story of his conversion and his encounter with Yeshua on the road to Damascus. Which implies that Jesus, who everybody knew had been put to death, had been raised from the dead, that he was still alive and well by virtue of his resurrection. And Jesus confronted him and invited him to change sides, to basically stop being a Pharisee and start being a Nazarene, stop being an unbeliever and start being a believer. And Paul had 3 days there in Damascus. This encounter took place on the road to Damascus, as Paul was going to that city to persecute the church. So he encounters Jesus there for 3 days. He was blind, and he fasted, and he prayed. 3 days seems to be a kind of a symbolic time frame that involves choice. It's kind of the crucible of decision. And Paul decided to become a follower of Yeshua. And Ananias, a believer in Damascus, came to him and ministered to him and restored his sight, baptized him, and announced his commission. And his commission involved, in fact, I got my paper Bible here with me this afternoon. So let me read that commission as it was stated actually by Jesus to Ananias for the sake of Paul to hear. The Lord said to Ananias, "Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel." Just kind of that breakdown of the mission field for the Apostle Paul was that he was to take Jesus' name before Gentiles. And Paul, or Shaul, was known as the apostle to the Gentiles, whereas Peter and the others were apostles primarily to the Jewish people. At least the priority was to the Jews. Paul took 3 missionary journeys that are recounted to us in the book of Acts. So he spent most of his time in Gentile territory making disciples for Yeshua. He was to appear before kings. And in the next couple of chapters, we will read about Paul's being brought before the Israelite ruling authorities, I guess they are called kings, Agrippa and so forth, but also the Roman governors there. First, he will appear before Felix, and then a couple of years later before Festus, the Roman representatives of the Roman government. But ultimately, as we're going to find out, Paul is destined to bear witness before the Roman emperor himself, who is the king of the great empire of the world of those days, and the children of Israel. So Paul had plenty of opportunity to witness to both Jews and Gentiles, and then the rulers of both people groups. So yeah, that was his calling and his mission. He recounted that to the people who were attacking him, and apparently they listened attentively until Paul indicated that Jesus' mission for him was to be an apostle to the Gentiles, and then they got furious and tried to kill him again. Evidently, for many of the Jewish people of that day and age, the idea of evangelizing Gentiles to make them part of the chosen people of God was an abhorrent idea and worthy of death. So yeah, they tried to kill Paul again. He was taken into custody by the Romans into the Antonia fortress, and their intention with him there was to interrogate him and get some information. They assumed he was just an ordinary Jew, maybe an influential one, but they looked at him as just a citizen of Israel. And so the typical way of interrogating prisoners was to whip them, was to flog them until they gave up whatever information the Romans wanted. And in more extreme circumstances, where I suppose the intelligence, the information was more vital, they would even crucify people. The Romans had no reservations about whipping and even crucifying Jews. Josephus talks about forests of crosses that adorned the roads into and out of Jerusalem especially, but in other areas of Israel as well. And that's how they treated Paul. And until Paul made known to them that he was a Roman soldier, a Roman citizen rather, that he was born in Tarsus as to a family of Roman citizens. Although they were Jewish, they were citizens of Rome, and so Paul was born a Roman citizen. And of course, his captors then, these soldiers, these military men, kind of freaked out about this because they were brutalizing a Jew, which was no problem for them, but you didn't treat Roman citizens that way. So that's where we're going to pick up the story today. Again, this is Paul's 5th visit to Jerusalem, where he is arrested. This is during the emperorship of Nero, and Felix is the Roman governor. Also, we've got a little map here of the events of these few chapters of Acts. Here is Jerusalem on the map, where Paul is arrested in the temple precincts. Today, he is going to make, in the chapter we're studying today, he's going to make his defense before the Sanhedrin. This is the path as Paul will make his way in the company of a troop of Roman soldiers, first to Antipatris and then up to Caesarea. Caesarea Maritima, that is to distinguish that Caesarea from Caesarea Philippi, which is up north east in the Golan Heights area. This is Caesarea on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. One of the things that I want to mention is that normally the Romans would, like the Roman governor, in this case, it's Felix, would be stationed, would be living here in Caesarea. It was kind of the Roman headquarters, the Roman capital. Jerusalem was a religious capital, but during times of the great festivals, spring, fall, and summer festivals, when there would be a great influx of population into Jerusalem, the Romans considered that dangerous times. So oftentimes the Roman governor would come down to Jerusalem and stay in probably King Herod's palace while he was staying in Jerusalem. As far as the Roman military troops there, they stayed in the Antonia Fortress, which was large enough. I guess it's about, I guess the Antonia Fortress, and this is contrary to popular opinion, the Antonia Fortress, well, let me put it this way. What is thought to be the Temple Mount today, as is recognized by the Golden Dome of the Rock, the Islamic shrine that is on the so-called Temple Mount, that's about 37 acres. And on the models of Jerusalem and the artist depictions of Jerusalem, you've got the Antonia Fortress as a very small building on the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. And but the Antonia Fortress was designed to house at least a legion of troops. A legion is about 6,000 troops. And then if you add all their auxiliary support personnel, you're up to about 10,000 people. And what is thought to be the Antonia Fortress would not come near to housing a Roman legion. But the Temple Mount would. The Temple Mount is about 37 acres. It is about, I think it's almost 3 times the size of the descriptions in Josephus about the size of the actual Temple Mount, which I believe was to the south of the present day alleged Temple Mount. I believe the actual temple was in the city of David, and it was about 1/3 the size of the present day alleged Temple Mount. So the temple was much smaller. It had to house fewer or accommodate fewer people than the Antonia Fortress. So I believe the present day alleged Temple Mount is actually the Antonia Fortress and would house a legion. Josephus says that the 10th Roman Legion, the Fretensis group, was there in the Antonia Fortress. But the modern day scholars who want to squeeze a Roman military troop into what is thought to be the Antonia Fortress, a very small building, change the size of that group. They make it a group about a tenth the size of a legion. A legion is at least 6,000 up to 10,000 people. But the Antonia Fortress, the alleged Antonia Fortress, was said to only house a cohort, which was about 600 troops, so 1/10 the size of a legion. But Josephus is very clear that that the 10th Roman Legion, all 6,000 to 10,000 of them, lived there in the Antonia Fortress. And again, so you've got the dimensions of the present day alleged Temple Mount and not meeting the size description that Josephus gives, and also the personnel who lived there not being the size that Josephus says they were, which leads me to believe that the the alleged Temple Mount is not the Temple Mount at all. It is the ancient Antonia fortress. So that's kind of the background to the text that we want to look at for today. We will pick this up in the last couple of verses of Acts chapter 22, just to kind of bring us up to date and where we are in this fast-moving scene of Paul's arrest. So he's brought into the Antonia fortress. They're going to interrogate him. They bind him in chains. But then once they discover that he's a Roman soldier, they treat him differently. So Acts 22, verse 29. At once the men who had been about to interrogate him drew back from him, and the commander was afraid too, because he realized that he had put this man who was a Roman citizen in chains. And of course, that was illegal for anybody who hadn't stood trial, hadn't experienced the privilege of due process. However, the next day, since he wanted, the commander, and he is a Chiliarch, which is a commander of 1,000. Here's the Greek word, Chiliarchos, is a commander of 1,000. So the commander of the fort here was himself in charge of 1/6 of the Roman legion. He's the one who wanted to know the specific charge the Judeans were bringing against him, against Paul. Here again, David Stern, the translator of the Complete Jewish Bible, uses the term Judeans instead of Jews. The general term, here's Judaion, is the general term. But first of all, the term Judeans is technically accurate. It's an accurate translation of Judaion. But rather than just giving the impression that every Jewish person was against Jesus and was against the Apostle Paul, he uses a more specific term, a more narrow term, the Judeans, to talk about those who were sympathetic to the Pharisees and Sadducees, and also to categorize the leadership of Israel and especially Jerusalem at this time. And they were against Jesus and against the Apostle Paul and the whole movement of the Nazarene Christians. So this commander wanted to know the specific charges the Judeans were bringing against Paul. He released him and ordered the head Kohanim and the whole Sanhedrin to meet. And then he brought Shaul down and put him in front of them. Now, I'm assuming that when they found out Paul was a Roman citizen, that they released him from his chains. Here it makes it sound like they kept him in chains overnight. But I'm not sure what is meant by released him here. I think it would have been inappropriate, particularly in light of the fear they had that they had chained a Roman citizen without a trial. I think it would have been inappropriate to keep him in chains. So I'm not sure what it means by released here. Maybe it means that he appeared before the Sanhedrin not in chains, whereas if he hadn't been a Roman citizen, he might have been brought before them bound. He orders the head Kohanim, the chief priests, and the whole Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin, of course, was kind of the parliament of Israel. It was, I think, at the time of the Acts of the Apostles, the Sadducees were the majority party in the Sanhedrin. And of course, that's because many of the Sadducees were priests or Levites. They were involved in the temple complex, temple institution. And then there were some Pharisees, a minority of Pharisees in the Sanhedrin. Usually the Sanhedrin was 70 elders, 70 leaders of the Jewish people. And so most of them were Sadducees, some of them were Pharisees. But I've read that the Pharisees were actually more influential, especially among the people, than the Sadducees were. Sadducees were aristocrats. They were kind of thought of themselves as above the populace, the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. the hard workers, the blue collar people. But the Pharisees were very popular among the common people. So Pharisees had a lot of influence, even though they were in the minority. So that's the group that the Roman commander requests to meet and to interrogate, I guess, to interview Paul. Then he brought Shaul down and put him in front of them. Here in verse 30, let's see here, let me pull my Greek up a little higher. The name that is given for the apostle is Paulon or Paulos, and that is obviously Paul. So there are many places in the Greek New Testament where the name Paul is used, but David Stern always uses Shaul. I don't think he ever uses Paulos or Paul as a name. Now, this would be understandable if, and let me see what our New Testament uses. Shaul. It also uses Shaul. So our modern Hebrew New Testament and our complete Jewish Bible agree that this guy's name was Shaul. And it was Shaul, but he had two names. He's called by both in the New Testament. But Stern and our modern Hebrew New Testament only use Shaul. Now, if this were just, if Shaul was a Hebrew translation of the Greek name Paulos or Paul, that would be one thing. In other words, if both names meant the same thing, like Petros is a Greek form of Kepha's name, Peter's name, but they both mean the same thing. Kepha and Petros both mean rock. But Shaul means small, or I'm sorry, it means to ask or to request something, usually to ask something of God. Maybe the parents of Shaul prayed that they would conceive and give birth to this kid. So they named him Shaul. They had asked God to give them a child. Paulos, on the other hand, means a small person. So they mean two different things. One means asked and the other means a small person. So it's not a translation. Shaul is not the Hebrew way of saying a little guy. Shaul means to ask, means something different. So I'm not real happy with that. When our Greek New Testament says Paul, I would like that to be reflected in the complete Jewish Bible. So in most of these controversial translation things, I am in agreement with David Stern in the choices that he's made. I don't agree with him on this one. I think it should be Paul, where the Greek text says Paul. So then he brought Shaul, the Apostle Paul, down and put him in front of them, in front of the Sanhedrin. Shaul looked straight at them and said, "Brothers, I have been discharging my obligations to God with a perfectly clear conscience right up until today." So what has Paul been accused of by these Jews? Well, that's what we're here to find out. That's what the Sanhedrin has gathered for. But the accusations that were being thrown at him and this was even of concern to the Christian church, the Nazarene Essene Christian church in Jerusalem, to the leaders, was that Paul's reputation was that he had abandoned the law of Moses and encouraged people to to be disobedient to it, that he wasn't honoring the law of Moses the way it should be honored. And of course, as a New Testament believer, Paul was free of the law of Moses. He was now under grace. He was under the law that governed the new covenant. But Paul, like many Jews, voluntarily observed the precepts of the law of Moses. After all, he traveled all this way to get to Jerusalem to celebrate Pentecost, which is part of the law of Moses. And it's not necessarily part of the new covenant law that governs the new covenant. So he's accused of violating the law of Moses. So he is a religious criminal, lawbreaker. He was accused of bringing a Gentile, Trophimus, past the barrier that separated Jews from Gentiles in the temple courts. He may or may not have done that. According to the new covenant, there would be no problem with it because believers are all one in Messiah. Jews and Gentiles are the same thing. Gentiles have, in effect, converted to Judaism. So, and the New Testament makes it clear that that middle barrier has been broken down. I think that's in the book of Ephesians. So, Paul is saying in response to these religious accusations, Paul is saying, I've been discharging my obligations to God with a perfectly clear conscience right up until today. He calls the members of the Sanhedrin brothers. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, they're all Jewish, and he's Jewish. And so he relates to them on an ethnic level. Also, Paul, although he is a follower of Yeshua the Nazarene, so the sect that he has allied himself with now is the Nazarene sect. He's a Nazarene Essene rather than a Pharisee. He was kind of born and raised a Pharisee, and as we'll see in the text for today, he still relates to being a Pharisee. And there are Pharisees in the Sanhedrin, and so he's going to relate to them on a religious level, on a belief level, to a certain extent. The Pharisees have officially and formally rejected Yeshua as the Messiah, so he's not going to agree with them there, but he will agree with them on some other theological matters, as we will see. And he says, I've been discharging my obligations to God with a perfectly clear conscience. One thing I thought was interesting here, and this is just the first verse. We've been going here for about a half hour and just getting to the first verse of chapter 23. The word that Paul uses for discharging his obligations to God is the word pepolitiumai. This has as its root the word politic, or political. And it means, as you can see in the information window at the bottom of our screen, that it means to live as a citizen. Now, this is interesting because Paul has just stated before the Romans that he is a Roman citizen. He is a citizen of Rome with all the rights and privileges of any Roman citizen. But here before the Sanhedrin, he's saying, he's not saying anything about his Roman citizenship, but he is saying that he is a citizen of God's what? Kingdom? A citizen of God's kingdom, and that he has been discharging his obligations to God with a perfectly clear conscience. So he is basically going to be saying, I'm a good Jew. He's going to talk about his Pharisee background. But as a Nazarene follower of Yeshua, he's going to say, I am in perfect harmony with what God has stated in the Bible. And he doesn't necessarily mean the New Testament documents. He's been writing some of them. He's been writing these documents already. And some of the Gospels have already been written, but he's not necessarily talking about the New Testament books. He's talking about the Old Testament, which also talks about the Messiah and gives predictions and prophecies and descriptions of him. And so Paul is saying, even when it comes to the Tanakh, the Old Testament, he says, I'm living with a perfectly clear conscience, discharging my obligations with regard to God, according to the Old Testament, same book you guys are using. And he says that's true right up until today. I haven't just recently started breaking laws. I'm still obeying the Bible, as he would say, as we all have it. Verse 2, but the Kohen Hagadol, Kohen is the Hebrew word for priest. Ha is the direct, the definite article, the, and then Gadol is the Hebrew word for great or high or most excellent. So this is the high priest. This is the one guy who was supposed to be a descendant of Aaron and Aaron's sons. through Zadok, the rightful high priest at the time of King David, who was loyal to him through all the rebellions that David experienced. This high priest was not. He was not a descendant of Aaron, so he was not a rightful high priest, but he was the official one. And his name is Hananiah, or the Greek version is Ananias, was the serving high priest. Now, again, for a Nazarene Essene, all of the high priests since Onias III, back in about 175 BC or BCE, were all illegitimate. So in Paul's opinion, whoever this guy is, he's illegitimate because he's not a proper descendant of Aaron. But he is in office, and Paul is going to respect the office, even though the person occupying that office is maybe a fraud, maybe illegitimate. So the Kohen Hagadol, Hananiah, ordered those standing near him, near Shaul or Paul, to strike him on the mouth. So Paul has just made this statement that he has been a faithful follower of God, and the high priest orders those standing by to hit him in the mouth. And then Shaul or Paul said to him, to Hananiah, the high priest, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Will you sit here judging me according to the Torah, and yet in violation of the Torah, order me to be struck? Now, this is interesting because Paul has already been through this issue of violence being visited on those who have not had due process, have not been tried in a court of law. With the Romans, they bound him, and they were going to torture him to get information out of them. And he says, I'm a Roman citizen. You don't treat Roman citizens that way. Now he's before the high priest himself, and he says, I don't know if the guy, actually, if those people struck him in obedience to the command of the high priest, but the order is a violation of the Torah. So not only does Roman law forbid abusing those who have been arrested and accused of crimes, but also the Torah does as well. So this command that the high priest gave to strike a prisoner who has not yet been tried, the trial is just starting. I mean, this is the trial before the Sanhedrin, and the high priest orders the prisoner to be punished before the trial has concluded, and that's a violation of the Torah. So this high priest, who's supposed to be the overseer of the Torah and God's system of justice, is violating it himself. So Shaul calls him a whitewashed wall, which we'll talk about in a minute. We're going to see, let me go ahead and read through the text, and then we'll talk about various parts of it. The men nearby said, this is the Kohen Hagadol, this is the high priest of God that you are insulting. Then Shaul said, I didn't even know, I didn't know, brothers, that he was the Kohen Hagadol, for it says in the Torah, you are not to speak disparagingly of a ruler of your people. So apparently the high priest was not wearing his high priestly regalia, his official robes and things like that to identify him as the high priest. He was probably just wearing ordinary civilian clothes, since he wasn't, for this meeting, for this trial, he was not officiating in the temple courts. So Paul didn't recognize him. Now, a lot of people find that difficult to believe, that a Jewish person, especially, an influential Jewish person like Paul was, wouldn't know who the high priest was and wouldn't recognize him. But keep in mind, Paul has been on 3 missionary journeys for the last, how many years? Maybe 20 years or something like that. So he's been away from Jerusalem, and high priests come and go. And so he didn't know that this guy was the high priest. It was unbiblical for anybody to order a prisoner to be struck before he had received his trial. But now he finds out it's the high priest, and he said, so Paul's thinking is, this high priest has broken the law, or this person has broken the law, the Torah, by ordering me to be struck. But if he's the high priest and I've insulted him, then I have violated Torah too, because the Old Testament says you're not to speak disparagingly of a ruler. What is this term? Archaera, of God, of ruler of your people. And that comes from Exodus chapter 22, verse 27. I think it's verse 28 in the Hebrew Bible, and it's verse 28 in English Bibles, but it's verse 27 in the Hebrew Bible. So that's why that reference is given that way. The parenthesis there for verse 28 is a reference to English, how it appears in the English Old Testament. So yeah, I mean, there's been two violations here, but Paul didn't know he was violating the Torah by insulting or criticizing the high priest. I want to talk about this term, whitewashed wall. Paul calls this fellow a whitewashed wall. So what the heck does that mean? That is a pretty common phrase among biblical era Jewish people. If they called someone a whitewashed wall, it was kind of a way of saying you're a hypocrite. You look really nice and clean and bright on the outside, but inside you're different than that. Let me show you a picture here that I included on our PowerPoint for today. If I can bring it up here. So there's our map of today. And this is a picture of a Jewish cemetery. I think this is in Jerusalem. Here you can see kind of the color of the ground in the background. It's kind of a tan with almost a kind of a yellowish flavor. But these are the grave markers, and you can see that most of them are above ground. I don't know, maybe a foot or two above ground. So I think people are buried shallow in Jerusalem because the bedrock is very close to the surface. So it's like there's not 6 feet of dirt that you can dig down through, because you hit bedrock pretty soon. So a lot of these tombs are above ground. I'm not sure if these are painted white or if just they're made out of concrete and have a white type color. But Jewish people always made sure that grave markers like this were painted white, because if a person walked through a cemetery or walked over a grave without a distinct marker that was painted white, that would render them ceremonially unclean because they'd walked over a place where a dead person was buried and wouldn't be able to go into the temple for an appropriate amount of time. So that they made it a practice to paint the walls of their tombs white, and made them, look nice and shiny and clean and bright on the outside, but inside they were full of dead men's bones and decomposition and all kinds of hideous odors and things like that. So this was a Jewish way of saying, you're a hypocrite. You look good on the outside, but on the inside, you're corrupt. So that's what Paul is getting at with this guy who orders him to be struck. He apparently doesn't know it's the high priest, but he's saying anybody who would order a person who's under arrest but hasn't been tried to be struck is a hypocrite. Here you are sitting in a leadership position in the Sanhedrin, and yet you, who are supposed to be an administrator of the law of God, you're breaking it yourself. And then it turns out he's the high priest. So Paul's a little bit embarrassed about that. This is kind of Paul's way of an apology. He doesn't say sorry, but I think it's his way of saying, well, I was wrong. I shouldn't have insulted or rebuked God's chosen leader. So even though Paul, as a Nazarene, would have thought this guy Ananias is illegitimate as a high priest, still he respects the office of the high priest. So here's Paul's thinking. Here's how he's going to approach his defense before the Sanhedrin. Knowing that one part of the Sanhedrin, this ruling council, consisted of Tzaddokim, those are the Sadducees, and the other of Parushim, those are the Pharisees, who didn't get along with each other, and because there were such significant theological differences between the two. Shaul shouted. So he raises his voice here to make a very prominent, important statement. He says, brothers, I myself am a Parush. That is kind of a singular form of Pharisees. He says, I'm a Pharisee, the son of Parushim, of Pharisees. So he was raised in a family of Pharisees. And it is concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead that I am being tried. Paul is aware that the majority party in the Sanhedrin is Sadducees, and Sadducees don't believe that all the Bible was inspired by God. They don't believe in life after death. They don't believe in resurrection of the dead. They don't believe in angels or demons or anything spiritual. They're all very materialistic, and some would say atheistic, but still they're religious leaders. The Pharisees, on the other hand, believed in all the books of the Old Testament were inspired by God. They believed in life after death, resurrection, and angels and demons and so forth. They did believe in a spiritual realm. So that was the theological difference between the two. And Paul is identifying himself with the Pharisees. Now, he is a Nazarene. He's a follower of Yeshua now, but he has a background as a Parush, as a Pharisee. And I think he would refer to himself as a Pharisee who converted to discipleship of Jesus, to becoming a follower of the Nazarene. So he identifies himself with the Pharisees. He says, look, guys, I believe the same stuff you do. And the reason that I am on trial here is for my testimony that I believe in the resurrection of the dead. Now, this goes back to Paul's speech that he gives to the mob just outside the temple courts who were trying to kill him. He speaks to them in Hebrew, and what he tells them is his conversion story. He says, I was on the road to Damascus to persecute the Christians, the followers of Yeshua. And who do I meet on the road but Yeshua himself? I knew he was dead, that he died on the cross and was buried, but here he is alive and well, risen from the dead. So he says, I've met a resurrected person, the first fruits of the resurrection. And so he tells that to the crowd, that he has encountered the risen Lord Jesus and come to the conclusion that he is legitimately the Messiah and the Lord of Paul's life, and he's become a follower of him. But Paul is saying that does not go against the Old Testament. The Old Testament is full of prophecies and predictions of the resurrection of the dead, that the Messiah would rise from the dead. So he's saying, I'm a Bible believer. Even as a Pharisee, I believed in the resurrection. I just didn't believe that Yeshua was the Messiah. Now I do. But it's because I believe in the resurrection that I'm being persecuted and so forth. So, that's the thing that Paul is saying is the reason that the crowd in the temple courts wanted to kill him, because he's a follower of a resurrected person. So Paul is saying, look, I've offended the Sadducees who don't believe in resurrection, but my experience is what it is. I've met the risen Lord Jesus. So it's concerning this hope of the resurrection of the dead that I'm being tried. When he said this, an argument arose between the Parushim and the Tzaddokim, and the crowd was divided. So when the subject of the resurrection comes up, the Sadducees and Pharisees are at each other's throats. The Tzaddokim deny the resurrection and the existence of angels and spirits, as we mentioned earlier, whereas the Parushim, the Pharisees, acknowledge both. So there was a great uproar, with some of the Torah teachers who were on the side of the Parushim standing up and joining in. We don't find anything wrong with this man. And if a spirit or an angel spoke to him, What of it? Okay, let's see, verse 9. We've got the Pharisees and we've got the Torah teachers. That would be the grammateon. That would be the scribes, the sophrim. And both the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Nazarene Essenes had scribes. They had Torah teachers, Bible scholars. And so the Torah teachers, the scribes that were on the side of the Pharisees, said, we don't find anything wrong with this man. If a spirit or an angel spoke to him, what of it? Now, Paul had talked about his conversion on the road to Damascus, and what a person risen from the dead, Jesus had spoken to him. And so these Torah teachers who are sympathetic to the Pharisee position say, we do believe in the resurrection. So if a resurrected person would speak to this fellow Paul or Saul, we've got no problem with that. But of course they deny that Yeshua was the Messiah, and they deny that Jesus is risen from the dead. But they do believe that resurrected people and spirits and angels could speak to people. So they are saying, this Paul may be mistaken about who this was that spoke to him, but it could have been an angel. It could have been a spirit being. Could have been a resurrected person. So we have no problem with this, with a person who's come back from the dead, or a spirit or an angel talking to him. So they're starting to take Paul's side. Now, before we go any further, I just want to say how brilliant I think the Apostle Paul was to come up with this strategy for presenting his case before the Sanhedrin. He is aware that his life is in jeopardy, that he has been accused of crimes worthy of death. But one thing he is very much aware of is that the Sanhedrin was made up of primarily of two groups, Sadducees and Pharisees, who did not get along with each other. So he thought, if I can turn these two groups against each other and kind of associate myself with the Pharisee side of it, like the importance of my trial may get lost in the argument between the Sadducees and Pharisees. And like I say, I think that is brilliant. Paul is shifting the attention away from himself to a theological issue that these two groups are never going to agree on unless they become followers of Yeshua. So some Sadducees became believers, some Pharisees became believers, and they got along fine under the terms of the new covenant. So verse 10, the dispute between the Sadducees and Pharisees became so violent that the commander, fearing that Shaul would be torn apart by them, ordered the soldiers to go down and take him by force and bring him back into the barracks. Now, I kind of wonder what kind of an impression this debate that turns into a violent riot in the midst of this group called the Sanhedrin, the ruling council of all Israel. I wonder what kind of an impression that made on the commander, this Roman commander. So for one thing, he gets Shaul, he gets the Apostle Paul out of that place and takes him back to the barracks. But his opinion of the ruling council of the Jewish people must have been very negative. He must have felt a lot of criticism towards them, that here they didn't even have the dignity to, or they didn't even have the self-control to give dignity to this trial that they were conducting. They let it, deteriorate into a violent riot. So he probably lost a lot of respect for the Jewish leadership because of that. Verse 11, the following night, the Lord stood by Paul, and said, take courage, for just as you have borne a faithful witness to me in Jerusalem, so now you must bear witness in Rome. So this is all along the road home from the third missionary journey, all these people are telling Paul, don't go to Jerusalem. But I'm convinced that he's convinced that it was God's will for him to go to Jerusalem. And I don't know if God made it clear to him why he wanted Paul to go to Jerusalem. He probably didn't. He probably just said, Paul, I want you to go to Jerusalem. I've got plans for you. But he probably didn't tell him what those plans were. Now he appears to him after standing trial before the Sanhedrin. And he said, you must bear witness now in Rome. So Paul is going to realize that having made his plea as a Roman citizen to appeal his case before Caesar, he's not only going to go to Rome, but he's going to be able to bear witness of Yeshua before the Roman emperor. And that would be a great thrill. It would be kind of the pinnacle of his ministry career to be able to go to Rome to witness before the Roman emperor. It would be scary because Nero was a pretty horrible person. And he's another one of those rulers that started out good, but like power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And Nero became a pretty despicable person. But Paul doesn't care. This is the pinnacle of success, to give a testimony before the Roman emperor. So I'm sure he was thrilled to hear this. The next day, some of the Judeans formed a conspiracy, took an oath saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Shaul. Now, this is galactically stupid. The Bible warns constantly about taking vows that you can't keep. And this is an obvious example. So these Jewish guys, they formed a conspiracy and they took an oath. What is the Greek word here? It is not just any oath. The Hebrew term here is shavua, which is just a promise. They promised. They received upon themselves a promise. But the Greek word here is anathematisan. It's an anathema. Even English speakers may be familiar with this. Anathema means not only if I break this promise, may I receive some kind of punishment, but it means may I be punished with eternal death, with eternal separation from God, and an eternal destiny of hell, the lake of fire. This is a serious vow that they took. They're saying if we don't fulfill our vow, may we spend eternity in hell. And the oath that they took was that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Shaul. So Shaul died. Most historians and chronological scholars say he died in 68. This is 62 or perhaps even 61. So in order to keep this vow, these guys are going to have to go without eating for like 6 or 7 years. So do you think they did? No, they broke their vow, but it was a stupid vow to take. In the Sermon on the Mount, Yeshua says, don't be swearing by stuff, whether it's the temple or God's throne in heaven or the hairs on your head or whatever it is. He says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. So when you sin before God and you go to him and you confess your sins, don't vow that you'll never commit that sin again. Just say, Lord, my intention is never to commit this sin again. I am dedicated to never committing this sin again. But don't vow, like don't put your eternal life on the line that you're not going to commit that sin again. Because I know from experience that when I sin, I'm determined never to do it again, but I don't dare vow that because I haven't been able to keep that vow. So these guys vowed that they're going to kill Saul and they're not going to eat or drink anything. So more than 40 were involved in this plot. Again, it's a stupid thing to do, but they are just wanting to impress their friends, I guess, how serious they are in their desires to kill Saul. And I don't know, maybe these guys are like religious leaders. They're definitely religious zealots, but this is no way to demonstrate your faith, to plot to kill a person. And not only to kill him, like to take him through the courts and hope that a verdict is passed against him and that he'll be killed this way. They want to assassinate him. So more than 40 were involved in this plot. They went to the head Kohanim, to the chief priests and the elders, and said, "We have bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food until we have killed Shaul, Saul. What you are to do." Now, this is what these 40 say to the elders, to the religious leaders of the Jewish people. What you're to do is make it appear to the commander, to the Roman leader, that you and the Sanhedrin want to get more accurate information about Shaul's case so that he will bring him down to you, while we, for our part, are prepared to kill him before he ever gets to the Sanhedrin. So these 40 are going to make a deal with the chief priests and the Sanhedrin and say, well, we want to give another attempt to try Saul. The first attempt didn't work very well. It ended in a riot. So we want to try again. We want to have him brought before us so we can try his case. And these Jewish religious leaders are to make this known to the Roman commander. So he will once again bring Saul before the Sanhedrin. So that's the plan. And they're going to assassinate him before he gets there. Breaking all kinds of Torah laws. But the son of Shaul's sister got wind of the planned ambush, and he went to the barracks and told Shaul. So Saul's sister, her son would be his nephew. So his nephew apparently was in Jerusalem and heard about this plot. Not sure how he found out. It would be interesting to know. So he came and told Saul, Saul, there's like 40 guys and they've taken a vow and they're going to kill you. So if, anyone tries to bring you before the Sanhedrin, it's going to end badly. So Shaul called one of the officers and said, take this man, his nephew, up to the commander, the Kiliarch, the commander of 1,000, the tribune, and he take this man to the commander. He has something to tell him. My nephew has something to tell the commander. So he took him and brought him to the commander and said, the prisoner Shaul called me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you. So the commander took him by the hand and led him aside privately and asked, what is it you have to tell me? Now, the fact that he took him by the hand leads me to believe that this nephew was probably very young, like maybe a teenager, or maybe even younger than that, maybe like a grade school size kid. Like, why would the commander take him by the hand and lead him somewhere? Anyway, he said, the Judeans have agreed to ask you tomorrow to bring Shaul down to the Sanhedrin on the pretext that they want to investigate his case more thoroughly. But don't let yourself be talked into it, because more than 40 men are lying in wait for him. They have taken an oath neither to eat nor drink until they kill him. And they're ready now, only waiting for you to give your consent to their request. The commander let the young man go, cautioning him, don't tell anyone that you've reported this to me. So then the commander summoned 2 of the captains and said, get 200 infantry soldiers ready to leave for Caesarea at 9 o'clock tonight. So that would be like 9 o'clock in the evening. It would probably be after sundown. And 70 mounted cavalry and 200 spearmen. That's a lot of soldiers to escort Shaul, Paul, to Caesarea. But there is a military principle involved here. It's called the principle of mass. Whenever a commander of an army is going to go into battle against another army, He wants to have as many troops, an overwhelming number of troops, to face a smaller number of the enemy. And I mean, like, the ultimate hope is that the smaller size infantry unit is going to see this massive military unit advancing on them, and they'll turn tail and run, and there won't be a fight at all. But whatever ground or whatever valuable territory that they might have been occupying, they'll just give it up and run away. But if it does come to a fight, you want to have so many men that you will quickly overwhelm them with your overwhelming number, superior number of troops, and that will make for fewer casualties on your side. So you want lots more than the people that you could potentially be fighting against. So the Romans here have found out that there are 40 of these zealots who are going to try to kill Paul. So to confront them if a battle happens, and if they're going to assassinate Paul, a conflict is going to happen. So the Romans put together 200 infantry soldiers, 200 spearmen, and 70 mounted cavalry. That's 470 people. That's more than 10 times the number of troops that will be facing them. And that's brilliant. It's smart. The Romans have the troops, so use them. So here, 470 guys are going to escort Paul to Caesarea. So he's going to be pretty secure. Verse 24, also provide replacements for Shaul's horse. The Greek text says katene. It's like an animal. We assume it's a horse, but it could be a mule or something like that, or a donkey or something like that. But we'll say it's a horse. Behema in Hebrew is kind of a large animal. When it gets tired. So the map that we looked at didn't have a legend, so I don't know exactly how far it is to Caesarea. But a horse could get tired, before they arrived. So they wanted to have replacements ready for Saul. When his horse gets tired, they can put him on a new horse and bring him through safely to Felix, the governor. Felix would be the Roman governor, not the Jewish king Agrippa or whoever it was. The commander wrote the following letter. Claudius Lysias, that's the name of this tribune, this Chiliarch that we've been dealing with here. His name's Claudius Lysias. To His Excellency, Governor Felix, greetings. This man, he's talking about Shaul, was seized by the Judeans, the Jews, and was about to be killed by them. When I came on the scene with my troops and rescued him, after learning that he was a Roman citizen, I wanted to understand exactly what they were charging him with. So I brought him down to the Sanhedrin. That's what we've been reading about in this chapter. I found that he was charged in connection with questions of their Torah, their law, their religious law, but that there was no charge deserving a death or a prison. So what did Claudius Lysias learn? That the dispute, the accusation against Paul, at least according to Paul, and as evidenced by the riot that the Sadducees and the Pharisees had, was that there was a difference in religious belief. Paul believed in the resurrection. The Pharisees did too. The Sadducees didn't. So that's why the conflict. So, but in his opinion, in Claudius' opinion, this religious difference is nothing deserving death or prison. Now, the Sadducees and Pharisees might have disagreed on that, but in Claudius's opinion, it didn't deserve the accusation or the desire for the death penalty. But when I was informed of a plot against the man, I immediately sent him to you, and also ordered his accusers to state their case against him before you. So in other words, Claudius Lysias is getting Paul to Caesarea, to the Roman capital, the headquarters there, where the governor is. And if these Jews want to pursue this case, they are going to need to go to Caesarea. They're going to need to travel to Caesarea and make their case before the governor. So the soldiers, following their orders, took Shaul during the night and brought him to Antipatris. We looked at that on the map. It's about halfway to Antipatris, or to Caesarea, and then returned to the barracks after leaving the cavalry to go on with him. So what was it, 200 and maybe 270 of the infantry troops and the spearmen? They were traveling on foot, so they were walking all that way. So they turned around and headed back to Jerusalem. They didn't have to walk all the way to Caesarea. But the cavalry, who were riding their cavalry horses, they continued the journey, and they brought him to Caesarea. Cavalry took him to Caesarea, delivered the letter to the governor, and handed Shaul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from, that Saul was from. On learning that he was from Cilicia, Tarsus of Cilicia, that's up in Turkey, used to be Asia Minor, he said, "I will give you a full hearing after your accusers have also arrived," and ordered him to be kept under guard in Herod's headquarters. And that is the end of chapter 23. So we have learned about, in this chapter for today, we've learned about Saul's trial before the Sanhedrin, and how that turned out. There was a threat on his life. Now he's up in Caesarea. He's going to be there for a while, but he's going to have an opportunity to witness to some very key people in the future. So that will be very interesting, and will give us some additional data, some additional information about Paul's personal testimony. He's going to be talking about his conversion experience on the road to Damascus. He's going to be talking about his ministry experiences on his missionary journeys and things like that. So that'll be about it for today. Let me give you the, since we've been talking about the Torah, let me give you the Torah blessing from Numbers chapter 6. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you peace. Hope to see you next time for chapter 24.